if the Islanders make the trade, they're probably going to have to trade a contract with probably a bunch of picks and maybe a youngster.
Yeah,
so
Lee or Nelson maybe.
Brock Nelson could be a guy that they would have to move. I don't think they're going to want Anders Lee. Anders Lee is making almost $7.5 million. He's an overpaid captain on the Islanders. They're going to want guys like Oliver Wahlstrom. They're going to probably want one of those defensemen, Pulak or Pelech. They could add defense. They don't need defense, but they can add defense to that roster. Pulak and Pelech are still fairly young. I could see something like that, especially after signing a couple of defensemen this offseason. I could see them moving a defenseman. They did sign Mayfield, and Mayfield had one of his best seasons, if not his best season. And they got him on a cheap. They did sign him 7 years, but $3.5 million. That's a really good deal. When you look at Pelech, Pelech's making about $5.5 million, and then Pulak's making a little bit more than that. So I think that if you move one or the other and maybe give up a Wahlstrom and maybe a first this year and a second this year and maybe a third next year, I think you can get DeBrincat. Ottawa didn't really give up much for DeBrincat.
No.
They had a steal for DeBrincat, and I think because he didn't want to play for Chicago anymore, he pushed his way out. He goes to Ottawa, and Ottawa's a great young team, and he had 40 goals this year. If he goes to the Islanders, he'll probably play on the first line. You put him with Bo Horvat and Barzal, you have one of the young and talented lines right now in the NHL. The Islanders are pretty good from 1 to 4. I know a lot of people say that the Islanders are the oldest team in the NHL, which they are, but if they add a guy like DeBrincat, he's 25 years old. You have Barzal, who's 25 years old. They all got extensions. They're all going to be playing there for at least 7 or 8 years. If you add DeBrincat, he's going to get an extension of 7, 8 years. Now you put these guys together for the next 4 to 5 years before you decide to move on from one or the other, and then you can build your team around these guys with Sorokin. They'll find a way to make it work if they can make the trade. And we know Stevie Yzerman. He loves to make these deals. He wants to bring in another goal scorer. This Detroit team is going to be a force to be reckoned with. Yep. They have some good young players in their farm system, and Yzerman has really been building this farm system ever since he's taken over this team 3-4 years ago. And what he did with Tampa, Stevie Yzerman was a great player, one of the greatest centers to ever play in the NHL. So he understands how to build a roster and put the roster together where it makes sense moving forward. And with Detroit in the Eastern Conference could definitely make the playoffs this year because the Eastern Conference is so wide open. There's so much talent in the Eastern Conference. So anything's possible. And they have good goaltending too. I question this whole DeBrincat thing. And is Lou willing to give up another first-round draft pick to land DeBrincat? He has given up his last 3 first-round draft picks for players and second-round draft picks practically. This year they had a second-round draft pick. Last year they had a second, but the year before that, for J.P. Pajot, they gave up a first and a second for him. And Pajot's another guy that they could look to trade. Pajot is making about $5.5 $6 million. There's a lot of teams looking for a good face-off guy. Pajot is one of the top 5 in the league. They have Bo Horvat. They have 2 of the top 10 face-off guys in the NHL. And Pajot has not stayed healthy over the last 2 years for the Islanders. Hasn't produced as much as we expect him for the amount of years and the amount of money the Islanders paid him. I don't attack Lou Lamariello for trading their first-round draft pick for Bo Horvat. And everybody says, well, Bo Horvat, when he was traded, look at what he did. Beauvillier was dominating in Vancouver, and Bo Horvat fell apart. Bo Horvat fell apart when Barzal got hurt. They were hot. When Bo Horvat was traded, he had like 2 goals in 4 games. Barzal had a 5 or 6 point scoring streak, and then he gets hurt, and he's out for the rest of the season. He comes back in the playoffs, and Barzal was a shell of himself because hockey is a sport where your skating has to come week in and week out. It takes weeks to come back. Your speed come back. Your puck handling skills come back. You can't just step on the ice and compete against some of the best in the world. So it doesn't work. Everybody's, well, Barzal didn't play well in the playoffs. He was out for 20 some odd games. Right. I expect if Bo Horvat stays healthy this year and Barzal stays healthy, I expect him to have big years. And if you bring in an Alex DeBrincat to that line, you're talking about one of the best young lines in the NHL right now. And everybody says, well, you can't win with one line. Boston did. Everybody said, well, Boston had good lines. The Islanders have good lines. The Islanders for years has had one of the best 4th lines in the NHL. Their second line has Brock Nelson. I'm not a Brock Nelson fan. And Anders Lee. Anders Lee averages about 30 goals a season. Brock Nelson, the last 2 seasons, has averaged over 30 goals and was an all-star. And they have J.P. Pajot on the third line. You can't tell me that the Islanders don't have the depth to compete against some of these elite teams. They do. And they have great goaltending. And if their defense actually holds up and shows up to the games, they're as good as any defense in the NHL. The Islanders are putting all their eggs in the basket to get DeBrincat because you put DeBrincat on that young line, they extend him. This young line will be together for the next 7-8 years. They have Sorokin, who signed an 8-year, $66 million contract. Pulak, Pelech, all these guys signed an 8-year contract. And that's what Lou is trying to do. He's trying to put his young players together where you can build around these youngsters and probably win.